Consistency is key. I think that's what hurts a lot of podcasts, and they're wondering, why can't I grow? Why aren't I attracting new listeners?
What were the elements that you picked up that you think made the biggest difference?
My biggest thing was, I promised myself, when I do this, I'm going to do it right. If I wasn't recording an episode, I was learning how to do it better.
It's not so much about you being the authority figure, it's about the quality of the conversations you're able to have with the guest and how well you're able to extract the information.
I had no idea how to interview somebody. I mean, that's a skill set in itself.
How do you keep coming with topics after 333 episodes?
That's the hard part.
Why do you keep going? What do you love about it?
So if I want to get information out to the masses, a podcast is a great way to do that. It's a resource for the community. I came up with a mission statement, and my mission statement was to
Jason, welcome to the Podcast Gurus.
Hassan, thanks for having me.
Super cool. Really excited to get into your show, Jason. One of the things that I'm most interested to learn about is the story of how you started, for sure, but like a welding podcast or a podcast for welders. I didn't think welders listened to podcasts. That would have been my original thoughts. Tell me about like the niche as a whole. Like who's listening to Arc Junkies and why do you think they are?
Mostly welding students, welders, welding educators, welding inspectors, anybody that's involved with the welding industry for the most part. I have a very diverse group of listeners. You know, like I said, it ranges from, people that are just getting into welding, maybe home hobbyists, all the way up to people that have been in the industry for 20, 30 years, professionals. It kind of runs the gamut. And you wouldn't think, like you were saying, welders don't listen to podcasts, but we spend a lot of time underneath our welding hoods. And it kind of gets lonely in there. So you need something going on, whether it's music, whether you listen to a podcast. So it's a great place, because you got a captive audience. They're not going anywhere. They're taking you with them.
That's super interesting. So when we speak to people about podcasts, right, it's always like, okay, we have a lot of people come to us and they're like, okay, what day should my podcast be going live, for example, right? And so our general advice is people that have like entertainment style podcasts go later in the week because people are trying to wind down. People that have more like career focused and like businessy podcasts or something that's going to help people in their profession should go earlier in the week because people are ramping up and they kind of want, that's our philosophy on it at least. And the reason for that is because like, how do most people consume their content, right? They're jogging, they're in the gym, they're on their drive to work, right? That's typically it. But I never thought about welders are under the welding hood all day. They're listening to music. I mean, the reason I got into podcasts because I had a half-hour commute each way every day from my university, and I just got sick of listening to music, and that's how I got into podcasts. That's literally it. I was sick of listening to the thing. And I can imagine welders have that on another level because it's not half an hour each way, right? It's hours throughout the day.
And some welders, they travel from one job to the next, so they may finish up a job in one state, and they've got to travel 3 or 4 more states. So now, they're catching up on the backlog of episodes.
Correct. That's super interesting. And you actually have very long episodes. I mean, you sometimes go up to 1.5, 2 hours, right? Most people will be like, oh, like no one's going to listen to that long, and they try to trim it down and everything like that, or keep it really tight. I guess for all those reasons, right? You can afford to go much longer, right? I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some episodes go as long as 3.5 hours. So it really depends on the guest, the topic. If it's an interesting topic, I'm not going to cut anything out. So I don't have a whole lot of dead space in there. It's constant, back and forth and banter between the guest and I. But yeah, you've got that captive audience. Like I said, a lot of welders are traveling or they're listening to it throughout their workday. So you've got them, for how, average workday is 8, 10, 12 hours for a welder. I've got them for quite a while.
Yeah. And so the other interesting thing there as well is it's a very skilled profession, right? It's something that you have to hone your craft.
Yes.
And so I guess the best welders are obsessed with getting better, or like, that type of technology that's come out. How do you use that sort of situation? Like there's all these different things that I'm sure people are just trying to stay up to date. And like everyone has that uncle or granddad that's like really obsessed with the intricacies of this bolt, and that thread count goes with that bolt, and that's why I use this kind of chamfer here or that kind of there. And so people that are like good with their hands, they get almost very like technical, obsessed with that craft, right? Do you find that like the topics that do best kind of fit to that as well in your show?
It kind of depends. I mean, because sometimes I get super technical. Not every welder that I talk to is super technical in nature. So I kind of play off the strengths of the guest. So they may have an interesting story as to the type of work that they're doing, or, the how they got into welding. So it could just be about the story. But other guests that I have on, they're super technical. So I can start digging in really deep. And, so the audience the episodes kind of serve everybody's curiosity, whether it's the story or the technical information or a mix of both.
And so how did you get into this in the first place, Jason? I guess you weld yourself. Is that right?
Yes, I've been a welder for the past 26 years. I'm a welding educator. I started off at the age of 15. I actually took over the podcast. I had a small inclination that I wanted to start a podcast at some point, but I was actually doing YouTube videos at the time for a company called weld.com. And it was technical training videos, teaching people how to weld through YouTube. And I had left that company because I missed in-person teaching. So I worked over there at weld.com for about a year full-time, and roughly 6 months before and 6 months after that contract as a part-time consultant. So I did about 2 years with them. Right at the point where I left and I was, going to go back into part-time consulting with them, it was like right around the time the pandemic was shutting everything down. It was about probably early April 2020. And like I said, I had no interest in starting up a podcast, but the Arc Junkies podcast had already been established by a gentleman by the name of Jimmy McKnight. He was a good friend of mine. I got to meet him when I was working with weld.com. I was on his podcast a couple of times. I was an avid listener to the podcast. And he calls me up out of the blue and he says, "Hey, man, I'm getting into a different industry. I'm not going to be doing welding anymore, so it really doesn't make sense for me to run a welding podcast, and I need to find somebody that could take over the show." And so I told him, I was like, "Oh, okay. I'm really big on connecting people, like networking, linking certain people up, where they would fit best." So I told him, I was like, "Yeah, I'll make a couple calls and I'll see if I can track somebody down." And he's like, "No, dummy, I want you to do it." And I was, "Oh, okay. Well, I don't know anything about podcasting." I was like, let me think about this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to work that time requirement into my life." So I thought about it for about 2 weeks, and, I was thinking to myself, I'm a listener of this podcast, right? This is a resource for the community. I don't want to see this resource go away, or I don't want him to give it to somebody that isn't going to be passionate about it, isn't going to do good things with the podcast, and, possibly let that resource die. So I called him back up and I was like, "All right, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm going to jump in with both feet. Tell me what I need, and, we'll go from there." And so he gave me a list of gear. He's like, "Here's what I'm using. Here's the good, better, best, based on price and performance." So I bought the best gear that I could at the time. I had like a little Roadcaster and, the Roadcat, or the pod mic and all that stuff, and a set of cheap headphones. And actually, I think I was using my Apple, not the AirPods, like the original ones on the cable. That's what I started doing. Yep, exactly. I started the show with this set of corded AirPods, and just started working through the episodes. And it was a steep learning curve. And I thought originally that he and I were going to do a couple episodes together where he was going to host, I was going to co-host, a little bit of banter back and forth, and I would learn kind of learn the ropes, and we recorded one episode, and audio was just straight garbage. So we recorded one more episode, and then he showed me how to edit. We did like a little Zoom meeting, and he was showing me, here's how you edit. I think I started off using Audacity, and he showed me a couple little hotkeys and, how to throw the intro in there and all that. And he's like, "All right, man, you're good to go. Good luck with everything." And I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute. I thought we were going to run this together." And he's like, "Nope, it's all you." So now I've got this podcast. The first thing that I told myself that I was going to do is consistency is key. That's the one thing. I think that's what hurts a lot of podcasts. And they're wondering, why can't I grow? Why aren't I attracting new listeners? You've got to be consistent. It was the same thing when we were doing YouTube videos. If you tell the fans that, I've got a new episode coming out every Monday, you need to have a new episode coming out every Monday. And I think that's why the podcast, when I took over, it was kind of struggling, because Jimmy was working quite a bit. He had family obligations and all that. So you might get 1 or 2 episodes every month, and it was never on a consistent schedule. So when I took it over, I promised myself when I do this, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to put out a new episode every single Monday. And I think I've lived up to that. I've been running it for the past 4 years. I think I've missed maybe 3 episodes. And usually, if I'm late, I might put it out Tuesday. But I'll notify my fans like via Instagram or something like that and say, hey, podcast isn't going to be out today, but it'll be out tomorrow. Or, if there's a holiday that falls on that. But there's been a couple times where I was just not able to put out content.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, consistency 100% in terms of your fans knowing when the episode's going to come out so that they can go and find it, right? And like every podcast needs that loyal base of fans. They need that loyal base of people that are just consistent listening to the show. And you're not going to get that unless you're showing up at the right day, at the right time, every single time, right? Because that's when they know, oh, it's Monday. There's probably a new Arc Junkies up. Let me have a listen. Or if there's a 3-hour podcast and they have a half-hour commute, listen to half an hour every day for 5 days
Yep.
and get up to their 2.5 hours of podcast out as well. I'm sure a lot of people do that too. And, people it has to fit their schedule, right? I mean, I had the podcasts when, again, I was doing my commuting, I was more of a listener than anything else. The ones I listened to most were just the ones that fit my schedule the best, right? And they were consistently there. It was one that went live every Monday, and it was a 1.5 hour show. It went live Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I was able to listen to the first one Monday, Tuesday, the second one Wednesday, Thursday, and the last one Friday, Saturday, because I was used to work on Saturdays back then. And so it fit my schedule, and I knew it would fit my schedule. So I got in my car. First thing I do is open that podcast because I knew it'd be there. If it wasn't there, then I may start shopping around. Maybe I find something else, and I think so. I get it from my own personal experience as well. That's definitely an important factor, and I'm sure everyone has a story something like that.
Yeah, and as a host, you don't want to give your fans, your listeners, that opportunity, because if they expect it, people expect it. They jump in their car every Monday morning, and they open up Spotify or Apple Podcasts. They're like, I'm going to listen to the new episode of Arc Junkies. Well, if it's not there, they're going to shop around. Well, now they're distracted. Now that they found another podcast, they may not come back to mine, or they like new things. They'll get into that one. So I want to try to keep them listening to my show and be consistent, so they're not shopping around. I want to keep them completely engaged with the content that I'm producing.
So that baptism by fire almost of you taking on the podcast so suddenly, do you think that was a good thing? Almost like, it's almost like I'm glad I got forced into it because it forced me to learn everything much faster. Or if you had done it again, would you have preferred a bit more overlap?
No, I think trial by fire is probably the best way to do it. Because think about like learning any new skill. Like if I wanted to travel to another country and learn a new language, yeah, I could probably do some online training stuff. I could learn some stuff through an app, but if I wanted to go learn, German or something, the best way to do that would be to just instant immersion. Just go there and live amongst the people and the culture, and then you figure it out by necessity. And you're going to figure out a lot faster that way. So, I mean, by him just kind of passing the podcast and saying, hey, good luck, bud, have fun with it, I think that was the best thing because I was completely enamored with it. And if I wasn't producing a podcast, I was researching how to produce a podcast. I was researching, how do I make the podcast better? How do I get faster at editing? Because this stuff takes quite a bit. A lot of people don't realize that, when you start a podcast, there's a lot of time and commitment, and I told my wife when I took over the show, she's like, well, how much time is going to be required? And I was like, oh, I got like an hour to record. I've got, an hour to, edit the episode, and then I'll post it. 2 hours a week tops. No, that is not it. If you think probably for every episode that you put out, you've got 3 to 4 hours on the back end, depending on the length of the episode. So whatever, however long the episode is, you can just double that. That's what you're going to spend on editing. And then you got to promote the show, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all these different, social avenues to get out there and promote your podcast. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So it's a big time constraint. So I think the trial by fire, it was probably the best way to do it because I didn't want to fail. I didn't want that resource for the community. Like I said, I didn't want that resource to go away. So if I wasn't producing or if I wasn't recording an episode, I was learning how to do it better. I was getting better equipment. And my biggest thing was Like my tagline when it comes to welding is make every weld better than your last. It's the same thing with the podcast. Make every podcast better than my last. So I'm constantly on the path of increasing quality, because if you put out a podcast, that's an audio format. Bad video is easier to watch than bad audio is to listen to. So if somebody hops in their car or they put their headphones in and the audio is just garbage, they're not going to listen to the podcast. So that was my biggest thing, was a constant state of improvement. I need better editing capabilities. I need newer plugins. I need better microphones. I need to set my guest up for success so that when they join the call, they have somewhat of a quality microphone, because I do all my episodes remotely. I want them to have good quality audio, because essentially that's going to be their episode. I'm highlighting that guest. And if their audio is trash, nobody's going to listen to it. So it's always a constant state of improvement.
100%. I love that. The usual advice to podcasters is you want to get started, because honestly, no one's listening at the start, and you're just going to get better. And as the listeners come, you're going to get better over time as well. And that's how we de-risk everything for people, right? Go out there, start a podcast. No one's listening to the first few episodes anyway. You got time to get better. God knows my first podcast was awful. My first 20, 50 podcasts were awful. Some would say they still are today. But everyone, no one's listening, right? So it's fine. It's risk-free. Start going. You're going to learn as you go. You had people listening from day one. That's a whole nother ballpark, right? And people, again, committed listeners coming in on the Monday, opening up Arc Junkies, expecting to hear not you, but the previous host.
Yep.
Right? And was there from his style. They were committed listeners through his way of interviewing, or his way of breaking down stories, digging in deep into topics. What was that like? Was there, not outrage, but was there a bit of a adjustment period you felt that the audience had as well? How did that go down?
It was actually very weird for me, because like you said, it was, trying to take over a podcast from somebody else. The listener base is already established. Now I come in a completely different personality, completely different style, because Jimmy, he had that charisma. He was an on-air personality. He just had that. He's a regular talk show host. You tune in and you're like, man, this guy's really good. And then I get on there and I'm fumbling my way through everything. And like I said, I'm used to doing video content. But the listener base was really receptive. And I think it's because we had done a few collaborations in the past. We did the crossover episode where he kind of introduced me and kind of let the audience know that I'd be taking over. A lot of the folks in the welding community that listen to the Arc Junkies podcast, they were already familiar with me because of my work with weld.com. That was a very high-ranking YouTube channel when it came to the welding community, plus all the stuff with Instagram. So people kind of knew who I was, and they knew what I was about, and they kind of had an idea of my credentials and my background in the welding industry. So I think that transition kind of made things a little bit easier because they were already somewhat familiar with who I was.
The key to success, let's say, if we could break that down into a lesson for people that are looking for a handover, having some sort of establishment in the community prior definitely makes things easier. But the lesson I take away from everything you just said there, Jason, is that crossover episode was actually probably really key. Even if there's only one and you're hoping there was more, you would still need to have a crossover episode if you're going to change hosts. Would you say that was the case?
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you just throw somebody in there, if they tune in, this Monday, and it's host A that's been running the podcast for the past couple of years, and then they tune in the following week and it's host B, they're like, who is this person? They're probably going to tune out pretty quick. So that crossover episode, and what we did that intentionally to kind of announce his departure from the podcast and announce, my taking over. And we literally titled the episode Passing the Torch, which kind of, plays on several different words, but you use a torch when it comes to welding. So it just fit. So it kind of gave people an idea before they even opened the episode what the show was going to be about. But and we explained, like I said, his departure. I was taking everything over, what he was going off to do, some of the plans I had intended with the podcast. So it gave people a reason to stick around.
100%. So on the line of constant improvement that you mentioned, Jason, so for what were the elements that you picked up as you were improving as a podcaster that you think made the biggest difference? Was it the mic? Was it the headphones? Was it something to do with style? Was it a mindset shift? Of all of the improvements that you made, was there one or two that were like, the biggest jumps?
I think just me getting comfortable behind the mic, that helped out quite a bit. And then the editing, like the plugins, because there's a lot of stuff you can do with bad audio. The plugins help quite a bit, whether you need noise cancellation or, understanding how that software works, setting up specific noise gates, being able to kill background noise, all that stuff. That helped out a ton. And then upgrading, I would say upgrading the equipment, probably third. That helped out quite a bit. But the biggest thing was like me getting comfortable behind the mic, not saying and all that, so as often. It made for, a smoother transition with the podcast, with the guests, getting comfortable with the guests. Originally, I scripted my episodes. Well, not scripted, but I would write down 10, 15 questions to talk to the guests. And I noticed about halfway through one of the episodes, I think I'd done this like 4 or 5 times. Halfway through like that 5th episode, I just took that list of questions and just slid them off the table so I couldn't see them. And I started having a natural conversation with the guest. I got more comfortable, and I think that's really what did it right there, is because even though I was trying to pre-plan and force the questions, it didn't make sense. It wasn't flowing with the conversation, because we'd get off on tangents, and it's like, well, now this question was supposed to play off the other question that was 15 minutes ago. It's not even relevant anymore. So I think that helped out quite a bit too, is, don't go in with an agenda, especially if you're doing a guest podcast, because you don't know where their story is going to take you.
110%. How do you get more comfortable though? So like, is it just reps? Was there a mindset shift? Like, how do you get more comfortable behind the mic with the guest?
I think it was just repetitions, feedback from the audience. That helped out quite a bit. Seeing my ratings go up, seeing the download counts go up. And I was like, okay, people are actually consuming this content. They're looking forward to it. I'm getting positive feedback. That made me a little bit more comfortable, because anytime you put yourself out there in front of a large audience, everybody's probably dealt with this. I still deal with it to this day, is you get imposter syndrome. Like, why me? Who am I? And so to get that affirmation back from the listeners to say, hey, they do find me trustworthy. They're tuning in to hear what I have to say. That helped out quite a bit. That kind of helped me relax behind the mic a lot more.
It's not just what you have to say, right? What we say to a lot of people with imposter syndrome is, people are tuning into the way that you extract the information, the story from the guest. They're there for the guest largely, but they're there also for the way that you handle the guest, which is something that you can learn. You might not think, what authority figure am I in the welding world, for example, right? But it's not so much about you being the authority figure. It's about the quality of the conversations you're able to have with the guest and how well you're able to extract the information. And look, honestly speaking, so my first podcast, Jason, me and Guillaume, we started something called Corporate Treasury 101, which was all about treasury and corporate treasury and cash management and how companies manage their bank accounts. Guillaume was the expert in the field. I was not. I'd never done it. But we were buddies, and we were like, look, let's do this podcast together. It's in his field. I'll join along, and you can teach me the concepts, and we'll record it and do it as a podcast. After 200 episodes, so we still have it somewhere in the intro that I'm not a treasurer at all. And then people come up to us like in person, and they're like, is this Sam really not a treasurer? Because like he knows all the concepts. How is he not a treasurer? He knows the concepts better than some of the treasurers that have been there for two years, right? He understands it. And the reason for that was because I had 200 conversations about treasury. I had 200 experts, well, not quite 200, but at least 100 or so experts, because before that it was just me and Guillaume, talk about treasury with me. And I had to ask them questions. That was the whole job, right? I had to be interested in what they were saying, whether or not it was maybe what I was naturally trained for. And just those reps made me almost an expert. And that, I had no problem now going and speaking to the head of a big bank, talking about their treasury systems, because, you've got all the reps under your belt. So the imposter syndrome, I think, goes away with repetitions. But I think to start, you have to understand that it's how you interview the guest, not your expertise per se. Is that what you found?
Yeah, I mean, and I did quite a bit of research on that because I had no idea how to interview somebody. I mean, that's a skill set in itself. So once again, back to YouTube University, how to edit a podcast, how to interview people, how to schedule for interviews, all these different things. I mean, these are all skill sets. And I mean, we live in a day and age where all the information that you could ever want is in a small glass and metal box in your pocket. So that made life so much easier. Was how do I interview somebody? And I'd pick up a little bit from this, a little bit from that. And I listened, I was an avid podcast consumer, so I'd be listening to Arc Junkies. I'd be listening to the Joe Rogan podcast. There's a podcast out here in Orlando called Mediocre Time with Tom and Dan. And I'd pick up on everybody's style and see how they could get that conversation to flow. Even as a kid, I was really big into talk radio for some reason, like my high school year. So I would just pick up these little tips on how to interview people. And I think that helped out tremendously. Because you don't want that dead space. I used to do something when I recorded, I think the best interview tip that I found was on YouTube. You play Interview Chicken with somebody.
I've not heard of this.
And so, I see your head's kind of tilted sideways. So this is Interview Chicken, right? Because I used to do my, before Zoom and Riverside and all that came out, I would do my podcast via phone call. So I just Bluetooth my phone right to my soundboard and I'd do the podcast that way. People don't like dead space. So if I'm having a hard time drawing information out of my guest, if I just sit here and remain silent, they're going to fill that dead space. They don't like that uncomfortable either. So they're going to start talking. It's a way to get your guests to start talking.
Leave enough silence for them to talk into.
Yep. And they'll just start filling the void with something. They'll tell a story. And then once you go to edit, you just cut that dead space out. The audience never hears it.
But do you feel like that's a good way to get good content out of people? Like, do they usually come up with good stuff out like that?
Oh yeah, yeah. They just start vomiting verbally, and it usually makes for good content. And then now I've got something. The guest is a little bit more comfortable because they're already talking. So then I just pull something out of that conversation that they just fed me, and I ask questions about that.
No, look, one of the best charisma tips I've ever heard growing up was, there's two things people love the sound of. One is their name and the other is their own voice. If you refer to people, Jason, if you refer to people by their first name, Jason, enough times, Jason, and you let them speak, they're going to love you, right? And so dead space definitely helps with that, I think.
And then it's all about getting the guests comfortable because most of my guests, I mean, they're welders or they're inspectors or they're engineers and they don't talk for a living. So to get them on a podcast where that's what I need you to do is talk. You've got to get them to feel comfortable. So usually when I fire up my system, I'll chat with the guest for 5-10 minutes before we get started. And then I'll just reach over and tap record and we just start having a natural conversation. In the first couple of minutes, they're pretty nervous, but then now they're not paying attention to that little red recording light. And now they're a little bit more comfortable. When I did the videos for weld.com, the camera guy, he used to take black electrical tape. He'd put it over the record button. Because I was really nervous. I'd look over there and see that camera. I didn't know if it was on or off. So I just always thought it was off. It's never recording. I didn't realize that he had a piece of black tape over it. So he'd hit the record button. He'd stand out of the scene and just ask me random questions, and I'd be able to elaborate. And then he'd come over and he'd film something that I was doing. And then next thing you know, he's like, all right, we're done. And I was like, well, I never talked to the camera. He's like, don't worry, I got it. I'd watch the episode when it comes out, and I was like, wow, this is really put together because now he's just taking my audio of me explaining what I'm doing and the video of me actually doing it, splicing those, and that just made me more comfortable behind the camera. So there's little tricks on how to get your guest, super comfortable to where they're not freaked out. They don't have that high level of anxiety.
So it wasn't just me that did. I did that trick with you today. You caught it then. You caught onto it then, didn't you?
A little bit.
He already hit record, but you said he didn't start the episode
yeah,
yet.
I seen the countdown.
No, it's a great tip. I definitely 100% with it. So people just shift in their seat when you say, okay, we're going to start recording now. And then you hit record and say, hey, Jason, welcome to the podcast. That's not, people, they shift, especially, we have the luxury of interviewing podcasters. Everyone's comfortable, right? That's definitely true. So perhaps we don't need that for this, but most people aren't, which comes to my next question, actually, because you mentioned there, right? Welders aren't typically the most out there people that are willing to come on show. And it's a very common fear people have about starting a podcast, or it's like a limiting belief that they have. in my field, people don't want to come on to talk about anything. They don't want to be on a show. People even say in my country, right? The British shows say like you can't. But this is true. I've actually felt this as well. It's way easier to get American guests than British guests. But how do you get people on, especially in a niche?
So most of the guests that I typically have on my podcast, I know them personally. I travel to a lot of conferences, seminars, job sites, just because I'm a welding educator. I'm an inspector. I've done some guest speaking presentations. So I get to meet these guests. I get to have a conversation with them. So I kind of know who's got the gift of gab, who doesn't. So I'll invite them to come on the show. If they've got an interesting story or an interesting background, I'll say, hey, I'd really love to have you as a guest. I think your story, your background could be very beneficial to the audience. I got to find a way to give the guest value and say, I think people would appreciate you coming on the show. So once they feel that kind of connection, they're like, yeah, I'll do that. So they're a little less apprehensive to, jump behind the mic, because everybody's kind of, like you said, everybody's kind of afraid. They're like, why me? Why would you want me to do this? So you got to get them comfortable initially, like right up front. Say, hey, I think your story would, it's very interesting. It'd be very beneficial to the audience. What do you think about coming to do an episode? I've had some people that, they've turned me down. They're like, I'd love to do that, but I'm not comfortable getting behind the mic or the camera or anything like that. So I'm working on some people, to see if they would come on as a guest, because I think their story would be very beneficial to the audience. And that's kind of how I pick my guests too. I've had a lot of people request to come on the show for kind of selfish reasons. They want to plug, their new service or their new merchandise line or something to that effect. And I don't want to turn my podcast into a 45-minute ad read to promote somebody's products and services unless they're bringing value to my audience.
I like that line. I just the way you said it, I think people would really appreciate you being on the show. I think that's a great line. I think it's a great way to frame it, because it almost makes the person feel like they almost now have an obligation to come or responsibility. Like they feel obliged, like, man, if I don't go on, maybe there is something that Jason sees that, and he's clearly very successful, and the podcast has all these downloads and all these great people have gone on. I don't think I'm all that, but Jason feels like there's a topic here that I might be able to help with, and maybe there's something that I should do. It's not necessarily just stroking their ego, because I'm sure you mean it, right? But it's also like, making them feel like they have something of value to bring, and almost nipping that imposter syndrome in the bud, right? Because guests have that as well, right? To come on the show.
Yes.
So that's really interesting. I like that line a lot. But I mean, you got to run out of people that right, on a weekly show, unless just that many people.
I would, originally I thought that, because I would sit there, I try to plan out my episodes a month in advance. And I was doing great, the first 3 years that I ran the podcast. And then all of a sudden I thought it'd be a bright idea to do the podcast full time and open up a welding school simultaneously. And so I kind of fell to the wayside with the podcast. I was still getting content out every week, but I wasn't planning them the way that I used to. I'm slowly getting back into that now. But I mean, there've been times where I'm at the third week of the month, and it's like, I need to plan out next month's episode. I don't know 4 more people that I could invite on to have as a guest, so there I go to Instagram. I've got a lot of followers on Instagram. I follow a lot of people on Instagram. Same thing with LinkedIn. I'll reach out, and a lot of times what I'll do is as I'm casually scrolling in the evenings or whenever I'm on social media, I'll screenshot somebody's page. And, I save that to a little folder on my phone. I'll open that little folder up and I'll start looking through and be like, oh yeah, I wanted to have this person on. Let me reach out to them and see if they'd be interested. And a lot of the folks that are putting out content on social media, they don't have that, they're not shy about speaking in front of a camera because they're doing it all the time to put out content. So that's been an easier way to approach it. So if I don't know them up front, I just start a casual conversation right there in the DM section, be like, hey, my name's Jason. Obviously, if they don't know me, I'll introduce myself, tell them a little bit about the podcast, say, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to, do an episode with me and share your story to my audience. And a lot of times they're like, oh, okay, this is kind of like a collaboration. It's good for them, it's good for me, and it's good for the community. So it just kind of works out that way. So if I don't know somebody specifically, I'll just start, scrolling through my social media.
And there's a second nugget there, I think, as well, which is what you said, which we do as well. You said, and share your story. Everyone feels like an expert in their story, right? And that's what we do with this show. It's just about your story. That's why it's not too difficult. We feel if you were to invite people about a certain topic or something like that, maybe then they feel that imposter syndrome will come on a bit more. But everyone's an expert in their own story, right? Is that the idea behind that?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, and like I said, they're already comfortable putting out the content. So it's like, just hop on, tell me, about some of the ways that you weld or some of the processes that you work with, or, how did you get into welding? Why did you choose welding out of all the different fields? Why welding? And so it just kind of goes from there. So like you said, people are experts in their own story. They like to hear themselves talk. So it kind of works out really well.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm super, I like that. I like those practical tips a lot. I think that's a really nice way to work with people that are coming to podcasting, to, convince guests to come on, which I know a lot of people struggle with. Some people just have that network, and then there's a bit of a flywheel effect. Other people really struggle. And I think you got some nice tips there as well. What other tips, Jason, would you share with podcasters getting into, I'm going to be specific here, getting into like a skills niche or a trade-based niche show, or if they want to get into, you're doing well, if there's like a carpentry equivalent or, everything else down that line, what advice would you share to launching or starting a podcast in a niche such as that?
So I've had a bunch of people reach out to me because, and the funny thing is they reach out for my permission, which I think is kind of odd. They're like, hey, I want to start a welding podcast. Would you be okay with that? Well, yeah. I mean, the more information that's out there for the community, the industry, the better. There's room at the table for everybody. And if people don't like my style of podcast, maybe they'll like yours. And I'll do cross pods and collaborations and stuff with them. But I think the biggest thing when I tell people, record 8 episodes. Before you release one episode, get 8 episodes under your belt. That's something I wish I had the opportunity to do, because you want to get comfortable with it. And like I said, you want to remain consistent. So if I have a backlog of 2 months, I can stay consistent, because as welders, we work some strange hours. I mean, there's no way that I could have done this podcast back in 2010. I was working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. We did that for about 3 months. I would have not had any time to record an episode, edit an episode. Like I'd pass myself coming home on my way to work. Like I'd leave the house, it was dark. I'd come home, it was dark. I was leaving at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning, and I wasn't getting home till 11 o'clock at night because I was also going to school in the evening hours. So there's no way I'd have been able to do a podcast then. But if I had 8 episodes under my belt, it would be a little bit easier. Everything's already edited, pre-scheduled, ready to go. Plus you get time and reps underneath or behind the microphone. You get familiar with your software. So you put out one episode this week, all of a sudden your guest cancels on you. You got to come up with content on your own. I've been in that situation because I didn't have a backlog of episodes. I've put out solo episodes several times, and I'll just pick like a specific welding topic that I'm very familiar with, because like I said, I teach welding also. So it's easy for me to just go down a list and say, okay, today we're going to talk about oxyacetylene cutting. So that's easy. But I would say start a backlog and then write down a list of topics. Once you've got the topics nailed down, then you can start finding your guests. That's one of the things that I'll do every once in a while is I'll sit down and I'll write down a list of 12 different topics and say, who do I know that would be a good guest to come in and speak on this topic? Because sometimes, like I said, it's about the welder story. Sometimes it's a specific topic that's relevant to the industry. So plan everything out, plan ahead. And that way you're going to be able to stay consistent, because like we mentioned earlier, consistency is going to be key for growth.
When you go topic-based, how do you keep coming up with topics after 333 episodes?
That's the hard part. But I mean, like, welding is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. There's new technology all the time, whether it's a new process, mode of metal transfer, waveforms, techniques, alloys. I mean, there's always something new in the welding industry. So like I said, I do a lot of conferences, seminars, oh, that's a new topic that I've never even thought about having on my show, so thank God for my iPhone. I've got the notes app. I just go in there and, as they come up, I just plug a topic in there. And when I start running out of content, I'll refer back to that list, look through the list, line up a guest, boom, we're ready to go.
Amazing. You sound like a true professional. You sound like you take it really, really seriously. Tell me why, Jason. So we went through the story of why you got into it, or how you got into it, let's say. Why do you keep going? What do you love about it?
This resource wasn't available when I went through welding school. Welders don't read well, typically. We're not the classroom type of folks. I don't know if you've ever heard of the VARC assessment, visual, audio, reading, and kinesthetic learning. There's 4 different types of learning modes. Well, a lot of welders are hands-on, video, and audio. Last would be reading. So we don't read a lot. So if I want to get information out to the masses, a podcast is a great way to do that. It's a resource for the community. And when I put together the podcast, when I took it over, I came up with a mission statement. And my mission statement was to help, educate, and inspire the next generation of welders. So like I said, this resource was not around when I was going to welding school. So I don't want to see this resource go away. And there's been times where it's like, man, it's not worth it anymore. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of effort. Like, why do I keep doing this? And then I'll get an email or a DM. Hey, I want to thank you for putting out this episode. Because you put that content out, I was able to go to this company and apply for this position. And I was able to pass their weld test because I know what to do because I was listening to your podcast. Or, hey, episode number fill in the blank gave me the motivation to start my side business. That side business has turned into a full-time business for myself. I'm able to buy a house, support my family, do X, Y, and Z. So it's the positive feedback that kind of keeps me going. I love Monday morning. I signed up for this thing called Chartable, like way back in the day. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It kind of gives you some stats, but it also lets you know when somebody leaves a review. Other than that, the Apple Podcast doesn't notify me that somebody leaves a review. So I'll open that app on a Monday morning and see a new review for the show about how the podcast has helped them along their welding journey. It's like, that's why I'm going to keep going. That's why I'm going to put out a new episode next Monday. And it's just feedback, that affirmation, being a resource for the community, the letters that I get, the opportunities that come from the podcast. I had the American Welding Society reached out to me shortly after I started it, and they're like, hey, we want to run a podcast, and we would like you to be the host and put out, 1 episode per month highlighting some sort of service or, some benefit to the community. And so I run 1 episode for them per month called Weld Wednesdays with AWS. So it opens up a lot of doors for me as well. And plus, I get to meet new people, and I get to learn right along with the audience. And I think that's why my show works is I'm genuinely interested in the guest, in the topic, in their story, and I get to learn right there with all the listeners.
That's great. Yeah, that positive feedback is definitely a big part. I remember the first email we got was something along those lines as well when we were running Corporate Treasury 101, which was, hey, just to let you know, I just got offered a job. He was a lawyer, worked for a law, to go in-house into a treasury company. And he was like, your podcast gave me the knowledge, the base knowledge I needed to be able to pass that interview. I just want to drop you a note and say thanks. And I wasn't, we before that, you don't even realize people are listening, like until you start getting messages because the first thing you think when you get that message is, wow, someone's listening. Like that's not just numbers on a screen. These are human beings, right? And they're actually listening. And then the second thing is, oh, well, I didn't, this is what that feels like. This is what it feels like to actually help someone or to put something out there for free, which, maybe isn't as easily accessible or in a format, like you said, where it's much more easy for people to get to it, whether that's how they learn or because that's just, they have so much time where they can't visually watch something because they've got the hood on or they're driving to their locations or whatever. So I think that's a really nice reminder as well about sometimes you can have some real nice moments with it.
Yeah, you get to see the impact and the reach that it has. It's helping people in their lives.
Well, I hope everyone has a podcast out there that they can feel that. That's a That's because I get it's also a bit topic driven. But hey, entertainment's entertainment, so I'm sure people get something out of everything. Jason, thank you so much for being on the show. This was very helpful and educational, but also inspiring and heartwarming at the same time. So you got a perfect mix in there with your story. I really liked it.
I appreciate you having me on, Assam.
That's cool. Thanks a lot, Jason.